So we recognize this is the end of the day for everybody. So hopefully this will be interactive. This is a talk that we first gave to the MedPeds residents, almost as a joke, because communication is something that we're passionate about and what we do a lot of in palliative care. And communication as men and women always makes for a laugh, and we all have personal stories, so we don't claim to be necessarily experts at this topic, but we all bring stories to the table. So please let this be interactive, and if you have stories or want to share and ask questions, interrupt us as we go.
All right. So a few obligatory objectives as we start. What we're going to go through today is we're going to take you through and just illustrate basic differences that start in childhood communication, just showing that this starts very early as we're growing up. Going on to describe how do these childhood differences affect us, how do they translate as we move into patterns of adult communication, how do these gender differences affect our communication at work, and then more specifically in medicine. What does the literature tell us? Is there any literature that looks into these gender differences, communication differences, especially in medical communication? So.
I think it's really important as we start is to start with a caveat. This is a hot topic and kind of a socially, politically loaded topic. And we just want to sort of point out that we're going to use language like male and female through the talk. But that these are not absolutes. Gender is not the same as biological sex. So I'm going to do my best. We're going to do our best to refer to masculine style and feminine style, not the same thing as male and female. Because gender is a social construct, right? It's sort of how we define what is masculine, feminine in our society. And it's just based on our culture norms, and it differs where you go in the world. We often frame this as a dichotomy, that it's one or the other. You either have a masculine style or you have a feminine style. And I think what we'll see as we talk today is that most of us are somewhat in a spectrum, and we may have a more masculine style at work, and perhaps a more feminine style at home. It just depends. So as we talk through the lecture, sort of reflect on yourself and sort of what is your predominant style.
So why talk about this? Why did we get all excited to talk to you about gender and communication? And does the literature say anything? So looking back at one study, looking at some of Michael's lovely med ed literature that he loves so much, looking at a study actually back in 2005, published more recently in 2011, they did a series of interviews with senior medical educators at the 6 medical schools in Sweden, so all 6 of their medical schools. And when we talk about senior medical educators, these are their deans, their course directors, their medical directors, so kind of the big wigs in their programs across Sweden. And what they found was that gender tended to trend, and these medical directors seemed to think this was important, sometimes for health outcomes, which we'll actually talk about a little bit later. But also, especially when you look at careers for women and really maximizing gender communication styles may kind of push someone into one subspecialty versus another. What they were worried about, however, is they thought, well, yeah, we can teach these gender differences and we can talk about it, but they really worried that it would be overemphasized, that it would kind of become a threat to the stuff that we've got to get through in medical education. And overall, they tended to refer to it, this is, it's not scientific. It's a little bit soft because it's more social, it's more political, like Michael was saying. So yes, it's important, but we don't want to focus on it too much. A brief caveat, all of these senior medical educators did happen to be male in the study.
So we're with a group of pediatricians, so we think it's probably best to start with pediatrics and to start with kids. And so we're going to look at some work that was done by a PhD linguist. Her name's Deborah Tannen, and some folks may have heard of her before. She did a lot of work in the 80s on gender and language and gender in the workforce, in the workplace. And this is a short little video that is going to look at the difference between boys and girls, so communication among the genders early in life.
Our cameras picked up a typical example of how the boys emphasize the ways that each one is better and try to top each other when they talk about how high they can hit a ball.
Mine's all the way up to there. Mine's up to the sky. Oh! Oh man! Mine's all the way up to heaven. Mine's Mine's up all the way up to God.
Look how different the little girls are. Rather than trying to one-up each other, they're looking for ways that they're the same. In this example, the first little girl says, "Did you know my babysitter called Amber already has contact lenses?" And the second little girl says that her mother and her father also have the same thing.
Did you know my babysitter called Amber had already contacts? My mom has already contacts and my dad does too.
Not only does she repeat the idea, but she even picks up the peculiar phrasing, "has already contacts."
The same?
So you can see, having learned our assumptions about how people talk to each other from experiences like this in our childhood, that the men would be attuned to whether people are trying to one-up them or put them in a one-down position. And that's why they come to interactions looking through this status lens, and why women instead are looking through this connection lens. How are we the same? Observe this pattern in nonverbal communication.
So you could hear the little boys sitting in the pipe there, essentially just one-upping each other, that how high they could throw the ball. And the little one won because he said all the way to God, so then they could top in to infinity. And then the little girls, it was much more about connection, and it was a little bit hard to hear. It was about connection, and they even had this weird way that they modeled each other's language because their daddies also had kind of things.
So looking at that, what are some of the differences that we saw in that video and that we see when we're taking care of pediatric patients or when you're picking your kids up from daycare or having a play group at your house? Boys tend to have groups of friends. It's not as much one-on-one, but they're very activity focused. They roughhouse a lot. It's not that they're fighting, it's more of a ritual opposition to each other. That one-upping that Michael was talking about that even came across in their verbal, comes across in kind of their physical interactions with each other as well. But what it comes down to is it's all about kind of roles and hierarchy, and a lot of times it does come back to kind of status in the relationship. So a recent example that we had of this that came up, it was actually right before we gave this talk. We were actually at the Covington's house, and Bill had been barbecuing. Y'all all know Bill Covington, probably. He had been barbecuing for about 24 hours straight. He had his brisket on the grill, all those sorts of things. And the guys are sitting there around the grill. He's about to pull it off, and he says, when I do brisket, it's been on there at least 12, 16 hours. The guy next to him, I do it all night, 24 hours, at least. I mean, it comes up all the time, and I'm sure y'all could think of examples where you've seen this.
And how do you contrast this with what is typical of little girls? That whereas boys have groups, girls have a best friend, right? They focus on small groups, and rather than focusing on activities, they're focused on the dialogue, on the conversation. And so they share secrets, they tell stories that only that best friend knows. And so it's bonding over their similarities. It's not the opposition. What's important, it's not that girls don't fight. And all the women in the room can attest to this probably. It's not that girls don't fight. They just don't ritualize their fighting. They don't fight for fun. So they still get in fights. But it's not the same as little boys. Does that make sense?
So what about when we grow up or pseudo grow up? Here, how does this translate as kids are getting older, as we're getting older into kind of more high school, college, kind of on? And I saw this picture and just laughed at first because, I don't know, I probably spend too much time reading Us Weekly and watching E! Entertainment and reading it from the nurses' stations or something. I don't know what's going on. But for those of y'all that don't know, Dr. McGrath, this is Taylor squared. Okay. All right. So this is Taylor Lautner star of Twilight, Team Jacob, and Taylor Swift, country singer. They had a brief dating relationship. But when I saw this picture, I immediately started thinking, what is going on in this conversation? Anyone have any ideas? Anyone want to give some dialogue to this picture?
She's getting tips on how to do her eyebrows.
Interesting.
Maybe.
Interesting.
I wish she would quit talking about my driving.
I wish she would keep talking about my driving. That's
Why don't we stop directions?
Ooh. This is getting good. I think we're getting some personal examples here. The story I kind of came up on, I'm this, star-crossed couples heading on their first road trip, and Taylor has, he has his MapQuest in his mind, and he is going to get from point A to point B, and he's thinking, I've got to exit in a few miles, and where's the gas? And, he is driven, going to get to that goal, kind of wherever their destination is. And Taylor Swift is flipping through her Us Weekly and catching up on the gossip and kind of getting impatient. You kind of see her flipping those pages a little more aggressively, and all of a sudden, why won't you talk to me? What's going on with you? And just really wants to know. He's focused on the task. She wants to know, how are they doing? Where's the relationship? Where's the communication and the draw? That's just... I don't know. That might happen to people. So what happens as we grow up? What are some of these differences? So similar to our previous slide, men and masculine communicators tend to be more focused on action. There's a job that needs to get done. They might be more assertive, more authoritative when they're working to get a job done, but at the same time might still use that sparring. There may be some playful insults. There may be some verbal sparring with each other, some one-upping while they're playing or while they're working. But again, it comes back to asserting status, to having this hierarchy. And this can be good and bad. There's nothing wrong with masculine communicating or feminine communicating. A masculine communicator might be very task-oriented, really working to get the job done. Where they have to be careful is it may come at the expense of relationships, either at work or at home, because they are so task-oriented and driven, and they kind of lose the social aspect of work and kind of their dynamics, and whether it's with a patient, with a colleague, or with a spouse or a partner at home.
And so you can really contrast that with what we saw with little girls. What is a more feminine communication style that the focus is more on the discussion, the dialogue. It's about building relationship. And so oftentimes it's perceived as a more warmer, engaging style, right, compared to a more authoritative, demanding style. And it's all about finding mutual connection. So, I tell you about my dad being sick. A feminine communicator will also reflect about a story of their own sick loved one to make that personal connection, that we're the same. So we're going to equalize status instead of asserting our status, our hierarchy. So one way that we often see differences in the genders or in communication styles is in our nonverbal communication. And I think this is fascinating in how you probably don't even notice it, right? This is just the way we all do this. Men tend to have much less formal styles when they're just interacting with groups. It's very common for a man to come into a room and to sit far back in the chair with the legs up, the feet up on the table. It's not meant to be demeaning or disrespectful. It's just very informal, whereas women, to show the connection, are going to sit up, they're going to lean forward, they're going to make eye contact, they're going to connect. Think about the last time that you went out with a group of guys or a group of girls, when you went out somewhere socially. Guys go to a bar to watch a game. They go to the bar and they all line up at the bar and they all stare at the television. No one's actually looking at each other. They're all staring at the game. So it's about the activity. It's still together, but they're focused on activity. Women go to a coffee shop somewhere. They pull all the chairs around the table. They all sit right up against one another so that they can see each other and they can talk, right? Similarly, in how we, is there anything else in this slide? Okay. Let's talk about work.
Work. So we see this, we're not always shop talking when we're at work. We see this even in our small talk, in our interactions with our coworkers. So masculine communicators may use more athletic references. It goes back to that sparring, that playfulness, some sexual language, joking, swearing. It's all in that verbal sparring and that ritual communication that they have. Feminine communicators, on the other hand, may use more compliments. They may really strategize to minimize differences, to say, we're on the same team, we're working together to get this done, and really trying to engage the person that they're working with.
When you look at, similarly at work, differences in leadership style, for a masculine communicator, it's much more acceptable to give orders, right, to reinforce status, whereas a feminine communicator is going to try to minimize the difference and save face. And I think this is really important for female physicians, because what happens when a female physician gives an order, particularly to another female?
That's a fight.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but yeah.
Sometimes it works.
In our residency class, there were some guys that their orders were taken a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really common experience for female physicians, especially as they're starting out, because they're confused as the nurse and when's the doctor really coming, and then to actually give an order, suddenly they break out of that feminine communication style and assert their status, and will get called names and things like that, where it's much more acceptable for a man to do that. And sometimes for a man who has a more feminine style and is more passive, that can also be taken the wrong way. You'll often see feminine communicators use more disclaimers, and you've probably learned this tactic to get things done, right? I'm sure you've already thought of this, but could you go ahead and send those stat labs that I ordered 4 hours ago?
You've done it in the ER, in the PICU. Mm-hmm. No, absolutely.
Another way that we see differences is in how we give compliments. This is a language ritual that we do all the time. And I think this one's fascinating. I actually saw this morning when I got to work. I was sitting at the computer looking at my patients over at UAB, and the nurse practitioner came in, and our nurse coordinator was already in there sort of talking to me. And the nurse practitioner came in, and she just got a haircut. And reflexively, like instinctively, the nurse coordinator turns and says, "Oh my gosh, your hair looks so good. Did you get a haircut?" And the response was, "I did, thank you. Your hair also looks fantastic today." And so it's given this reflexive, I'm going to give you a compliment, and you give me the compliment back.
Men, on the other hand, maybe not so much. Maybe you've had this happen, but for example, Michael, I really like your tie.
Thanks. I actually got it at the Goodwill. It was $2.
Huh. Did anyone hear him kind of reflexively compliment my skirt, which is awesome, by the way? No, it didn't happen. It's not part of his reflexive communication. Not only did he acknowledge his tie, but he one-upped himself. Like, yeah, it's a cool tie. And I only spent $2 on it. It was a deal. So even in his own dialogue, he's one-upping himself. It's just a difference. And you could imagine how that might lead to conflict.
I really have to check myself when I come to work at Children's and in the palliative care office, and we work with 2 ladies in the office, and this ritual of compliment, it's just not one I know. And so when they come in and they comment on my shoes or the pants that I'm wearing that day, to me that's just odd. I didn't fish for a compliment. I didn't ask for that compliment. And what am I supposed to do in return? Compliment this woman for her blouse? So it comes across as this very weird exchange where I stop and I'm okay, give a compliment back.
So obviously this can lead to some conflict at work. Masculine communicators may perceive personal information as in relationship building. A lot of times that we see in patient encounters, in relationships at work, oh, that's just kind of touchy-feely. It's not necessary. Why are they telling me this?
And if you don't have that time, right, to actually talk about the personal stuff, the touchy-feely stuff, you may feel pressured into these decisions prematurely, right?
And then they may misinterpret, similar to what we were talking about already, they may kind of misinterpret kind of feminine communicators' aggressiveness or assertiveness. They may just interpret that incorrectly because it's coming from the wrong gender. That communication style doesn't match that gender. And that's when you get into that paradox that Michael was talking about, where the man that gives the order is the boss and the woman that gives the order is the bitch. You know, kind of that paradox.
You'll see this a lot more on the pediatric side than on the medicine side.
Not necessarily.
When my son was in the hospital, my husband made the comment, if I make a suggestion to the nurses, it's carried out without question. If you make a suggestion to the nurses, they ask about 500 questions and get a relief. And it can be the same wording, same suggestion, exact same thing. He observed it completely independently of any, he was like, and I see the same thing when a female doctor makes a suggestion to the nurses get a relief. When a male doctor makes a suggestion, the nurses just opt in. And this was a complete independent, and obviously this was a lot of months of time, and this was a complete independent observation. And I just wondered if it was more on the pediatric side than on the medicine side.
What do you think?
It wasn't at Cooper Green.
Right.
I did not
I got
have the
everything
female
done at
flirt.
Cooper Green by.
So
yeah.
it definitely, it happens. It may just be more unit specific or just, I mean, I think it's person specific, whether or not they're going to have those kind of biases coming into the conversation before. So it's definitely not all females react this way, all males react that way. But I see it a good bit.
And I will say that, I mean, and this is, anecdotal. I haven't studied it. But I think that in general in pediatrics, we tend to be more possessive of our patients and sort of really advocate for them and sort of they're our patients. And so to challenge that sort of authority, these nurses really, they love their job and they're protecting children. And so there's that sort of feel that they're going to protect them. And I think it goes back to the culture we live in and taking orders from a woman. And there's a lot to it. Whether I see it more on this side than the adult side, not necessarily. Yeah. I think, as Ashley was saying, it can be misinterpreted for someone who has a masculine style. If someone has a feminine style and yet someone responds to them with a masculine approach, particularly with ritual opposition, that I'm going to, for the hell of it, challenge what you're telling me. It's not a personal attack. But that's how we think through things together, is I'm going to challenge what you're saying. And that can be taken the wrong way, right?
Think of that on rounds, and someone throws something out and they're like, well, they're kind of pimping, going back and forth. A feminine communicator may say, oh my gosh, he doesn't like me, he thinks I'm stupid, because they're being asked to kind of defend their statement, whereas a masculine communicator would just kind of go for it and say, yeah, this is what I think and this is why. And you can see that whether the resident is male or female, there's different people that kind of how they interpret that questioning and that thing.
So think about
the point though that related to, because I'm a pediatric surgeon and I always say you sort of have to develop a schizophrenic approach. So if I go to a meeting of pediatricians, I get into a whole different mindset, employ a whole different set of behaviors than I would with a group of surgeons. If you behave like a pediatrician with a group of surgeons, they'll just eat you alive. And I think the other point that's related is this becomes complicated in the dyad. So probably if you studied it, two men talking may be different than a man talking to a woman, subordinate, woman superior. I think the general things hold, but then power begins to insert into the process and I think changes some of the nuances of it.
Right. And we'll talk a little bit about, when we just sort of briefly look at some of the literature that's out there, they've looked at those dyads, and is there a difference when it's a male physician with a male patient or female patient, sort of what are the outcomes, what happens if it's a female doctor? I think it's a really interesting question. So, problem solving, this is something we deal with every day. And the difference in how men and women, or masculine and feminine communicators, solve problems. And so you can look at this picture here, and someone give me a caption for this photo. They're just happy, they're just going to buy this car and drive off the lot and everyone's going to be fine.
No questions asked.
No questions asked. So he's really interested perhaps in buying a used car, and so he wants to sort of take a look at the prices. Because, you know, once you buy a new car, I mean, you drive it off the lot and it depreciates automatically, so why would you want to buy a new car? And she starts thinking, well, maybe I should call my friend Susan, because Susan just got that Volvo, and I should probably ask her about how much she likes her car. And then he starts to reflect on, you know, well, they have these hybrids now, maybe I could sort of look at hybrids. And then she says, you know, I just don't know if we can really afford this car payment in our budget. We should probably really think about how this is going to fit in with everything. He's getting a little bit more frustrated, and he says, you know, I think I'm just going to go to the dealer and actually drive some of these around. And then, you know, I remember my very first car. I was 16, and my parents bought me this red, and in frustration, he walks out the door and can't have any more of that. So has anyone experienced anything similar to that? Maybe? I see heads nodding. Yeah.
So how does this lead to differences in how we problem solve? So masculine communicators often are focused more on facts. They kind of seek resolution to the problem. They're fixers. They want to kind of get to the bottom of it and fix it.
And feminine communicators want to talk about the experience. They want to have, just like little girls, they want a common experience. What have my friends, family, what have they thought about the same thing?
Men may be more frustrated kind of because of this. So they may perceive lack of action and get frustrated by that. Kind of, why aren't you doing something? And when they offer to help, they may sense that ungratefulness of, I didn't want you to fix it. I wanted you to listen to me talk about what's going on.
And we see that all the time. We've joked about it. You know, I did not tell you how bad my day was so that you could tell me how you would fix my day. I'm telling you about my day so that you'll just listen to how bad my day was.
I'm pretty sure I learned that from JR. Do you want some advice, or do you just want me to listen? You know?
You learned that the hard way.
Because reflexively, I want to fix it. And I think that's why you're talking to me, right? Didn't you come to me for advice?
Of course.
No. So, what about gender in medicine? And there's actually not a lot of literature out there. This was from a pretty great review article that was published back in 2002, Systematic Review, and there are only, this is from 1967 all the way up through 2001. So that huge window, there were only 23 studies that looked at gender in medicine. These were all looking at primary care specialties primarily.
So when they broke down the data, just as a quick summary, I want to pull out some of the pertinent, kind of some of the statistically significant things that they found. And what they did was they broke down the medical interview into different sections. And one of the first things, or a couple areas that they saw statistical significance when they were comparing men giving patient interviews and women giving patient interviews, is that it was statistically more significant for women to spend more time on psychosocial question asking, as well as in the discussion of psychosocial issues. So not only asking that social history or asking about, did you get those meds filled? How did you get to clinic today? But using that information in their discussion of what are we going to do to, to help your blood pressure. In addition, significantly though, if you look at biomedical information, the very top dot up here, it was even for men and women. So it wasn't that everybody was getting the same facts that they needed to make the right decisions. It was just that women tended to ask more of the psychosocial questions, spend more time on that area. Similarly, when it came down to kind of socio-emotional behaviors within the interview, women had a statistically significant higher amount of positive talk. And I kind of read that and I was like, what do you mean, positive talk? So that is statements of agreement, words of encouragement, reassurance that they're making the right decision. That was positive talk. Similarly to the biomedical information getting, it was pretty even when it came to amount of negative talk. So it wasn't that men were negative and women were positive. It was that women just tended to focus more on that positive talk. So when you look more specifically at some of the literature on gender and empathy, interestingly, a lot of the trends that you'll see are that women tend to use more emotionally focused talk, so that kind of mirrors that previous point, kind of asking about feelings, kind of exploring those feelings when they come up instead of just kind of ignoring them and moving to the next topic very quickly. Interestingly, women tended to receive higher ratings in humanism. So that's all a perception thing, right? It's not that you're doing something right or wrong. It's just how your behaviors and your interactions are perceived by your patients. And then women tended to use more nonverbal behaviors, and those tend to be perceived as empathic behaviors. But when you think about it, I kind of read this and I was like, well, I was playing devil's advocate, and I was like, women are just creating drama to deal with. They're creating drama and emotion, and then they're dealing with it. But when they broke down these videotaped interviews, it wasn't that there were differences in the emotional opportunities within the interview. It was how the physicians chose to respond to those interactions. And what was more important than the response was how that was perceived by patients. So it was perceived well if they responded with a positive talk, with the words of reinforcement, those sorts of things.
So does it matter? That's sort of my question is, okay, this is nice. It sounds like that in general feminine communicators are nicer, or at least perceived as nicer and more humanistic towards their patients, but does it really make a difference? And one thing that I think is interesting from that original study we talked about, that review, is if you look at the very bottom there, the difference in the length of visit between women and men. And these are clinic visits. And when you look at the actual numbers, women spent 23 minutes on average for their clinic visit when they pulled all these studies together. Men spent 21. It doesn't really seem like a very big deal, right? It's 2 minutes. If you start to think about it, 2 minutes extra for every patient that you see, and you see a busy clinic, you have 20 patients, let's say. That's a moderate clinic. There's lots of clinics that see a lot more than that. And you have a 4-day clinic week, and you look at a year worth of clinic, that actually adds up to 15 days. So you can imagine at the end of the year when you're looking at productivity, and suddenly the woman doctor has 15 missing days from her clinic visits. Suddenly, the way we pay physicians, the way we are compensated, are we punishing those that spend more time with their patients and actually are perceived as better communicators with their patients? That's sort of a question. That's an unanswered question. When you look at more specifics, and so this was a cross-sectional survey. This was actually done in Germany, and it looked over, this was 2002 and 3, and this is a huge study, looked at over 50,000 outpatients and some 3,000 doctors. This is a huge database that they pulled this data from. And we're not going to dwell on this because it gets really nerdy. But basically what they saw was that female physicians did better with certain markers of diabetes care. They don't really speculate in this article. They sort of intentionally stayed away from that and sort of what that meant. I wonder if some of this has to do with communication and how that plays out with adherence and things like that. So similarly, there are some studies out there looking at gender communication and preventive care. And again, this is now looking at some of those dyads, some of those combinations of whether it's a female physician with a male, does that make a difference? Or what if it's just female with female? Maybe that it's just when the women get together that they really talk about things and the outcomes are better. And so what they were able to show is that certain gender-specific counseling, if you had a woman doctor and you were a woman patient, that you got better preventive care. But when you look at general health habits, and so this is having to do with diet, exercise, those kinds of things. It doesn't matter if you were male or female. You got more preventive discussion of preventive care if you had a female physician. And when it came down to sensitive topics, so these are things like substance abuse, domestic violence, sex, STDs, women significantly more willing to talk about it than men. Does that seem surprising to anyone? You don't think so?
No, because, the moms aren't afraid of getting in business. You're going to do what your mom says most of the time, and that's probably, right now, it's a way.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us, well, I'll speak for myself. We're traditionally a little bit more fearful of dads. So therefore we may avoid going to the doctor,
Yeah.
and those kind of things. And now also, dads aren't very good about bringing up certain topics, right?
Mm-hmm.
As easily as moms are, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because topics that we anticipate are going to be emotional topics, that we're afraid of the reaction that we're going to get back if I'm going to ask someone about their sex life, and I'm worried about, so I'm just going to stay away. I'm not going to go there.
I think there has to be a buy-in too for like the health habits counseling. So like how do you sleep? So one of my partners having some of my patients one day who came because the family was very upset they gave him a popsicle to go to sleep. And his response was, "Just give him a popsicle to go to sleep." And like my response would not have been just give him a popsicle to go to sleep.
Fix it.
Let's work on getting rid of the sugar at bedtime to protect the teeth, and then once we get rid of the sugar at bedtime, then we'll work on getting him away from this popsicle and the sheets, and that's a sticky mess, and like, and it's a very different sort of perceived like I see that as, oh, that's a threat to your teeth, which is a threat to your laundry, and he's like, who cares? Just get to sleep.
The kid shuts up.
It hurts when I do this. Don't do
Don't
this.
do that.
Fix it. Good gracious. One of the things that I thought was interesting with this, especially being from a palliative care background, is how do we see this play out in coping and in grief? And this is us as physicians taking care of patients, but also our families, our moms and dads, and how they react, how masculine and feminine communicators react when something very stressful and traumatic is put in front of them. And I think it's very similar to these gender communication styles, and I think it parallels really well. But I think it's a myth. I know it's a myth that men don't grieve. It's not true. But you see that, or you hear that said so much. Oh, he's just disconnected. He doesn't get it. He's just not emotional, therefore he's not grieving. And I would say instead it's more of a pattern. So similar to masculine and feminine communication, we have what the literature refers to as instrumental and intuitive grievers. So you can imagine that a masculine griever would be referred to as more of an instrumental griever. So what this looks like is the experience is more cognitive, it's more physical. And because of that, they express it cognitively, they may express it behaviorally in an outburst or in some sort of, what was I trying to say, position, like kind of a position and kind of their nonverbal communication. They may cope more by thinking or doing. And these are referred to more as head grievers. So when you think about it, it's not that they don't feel grief, it's that they may feel it less emotionally and more physically. So they may have more physical ways to express that grief. They may go to the golf course and take it out on a set of golf balls. They may, stomp through the halls and slam the door to the car. And that's just kind of that physical outburst of how upset they are and how sad they are. Maybe it portrayed more in kind of those physical things that we see. And at the same token, sitting down around a table and talking about their feelings may not go well. That's not how they grieve. So they may be more reluctant to tell me what you're feeling. And that question may just kind of fall flat. And so that's when we say, oh, he's not emotional at all. He doesn't get it. Or he's not grieving. He doesn't know what's going on. So similarly, in what I've seen kind of pattern is a lot of times there's masculine grievers and instrumental grievers maybe focused still on fixing and doing. So it may be, my son's dying of leukemia, but if I can fix his platelets, I'm doing something for him. And therefore I'm loving my son because I'm fixing things. And it doesn't mean he doesn't get that his son's dying of leukemia. That's just how he feels he can provide for his son. On the other end, there may be use of humor or kind of other feelings, anger, those sorts of things that may be perceived as inappropriate, but that's goes back to that verbal sparring and that playfulness that they use to kind of cope with emotions and the strong, heavy things that are going on.
So contrast that with an intuitive griever. Contrast with someone who has a more feminine grieving style where the experience is affective. It's less about thinking and doing, it's more about the feeling. And so it's expressed through mirrored feelings, and you'll see this, the need, similar to stuff we talked about earlier in this talk, right? The need to connect with someone else and share that same experience. I lost my mom. I want someone else who's lost their mom to share that experience with me, to know that we're going through the same thing together. And we cope by exploring those feelings. So these are the folks who want to go to some sort of support group, to have a social outing where the people get together to talk about their grief experience. These are heart grievers. What is fascinating to me as a palliative care physician is what happens when folks break the norm. What happens when you get a mom who is a head griever? And what do we call her? Or what do we talk about her behind her back? What do we say about moms like that? She's cold. She's distant. She's shut down. What we hear a lot
She doesn't
is
get it.
She just doesn't get it. She just doesn't get that her child is dying. Yeah. And what about the flip side? What about a man, a dad, who's a heart griever?
He's emotional. Yeah.
He's a rag. He can't get it together. He's just blubbering in there. If I should start counting the number of consults that I get, both here, both children's and the adult side, because the man cried. Like everything is fine until dad cries, and then suddenly it makes everyone uncomfortable.
We need palliative care.
And people don't know how to respond, because how do you like attend to the emotion? How as a man do I attend to the emotion of another man? It becomes people don't know what to do, so they call palliative care.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is okay.
So, exactly. So, kind of thinking about all this that we talked about, I think, we know this as pediatricians, that gender-based styles of communication are learned very early. We learned these from the time that we were little kids on the playground. And that these differences continue into adulthood through our nonverbal communication, through the way we solve problems, through our rituals of conversation at work, compliments, those kinds of things. Importantly, we are actively choosing methods of communicating to get work done. It's not right or wrong. It's just different. Men will use certain ways of communicating. They will use their body language to assert status to get something done, and it is very intentional. Women will use an emotional connection to get underneath and to get sort of go around behind to get a job done. They're both very effective techniques. They're just different. They're not right or wrong. That we can't help but bring this to the table when we come to work. It's how we communicate at home. It's how we communicate as doctors and how we interact with our patients and families. And interestingly, there may actually be some implications for health outcomes, and this is something that I think we'll probably continue to see more data come out of. It's clearly a hot topic and one that we have to be careful about. It's not about who's a better physician, but how do we learn from one another and become better ourselves.
Right. And I think that brings us to just kind of implications. What do we do with this information? And I think you made a great point earlier that you have to flex. But in order to flex, you have to know where you're coming from, and you have to acknowledge what kind of communicator am I, and know your own predominant style, because we can all communicate very masculinely, we can all communicate femininely. We may do one far more than the other, but it's in there. But you have to know your predominant style so that you can cultivate and kind of flex into that other style, so that when you're the surgeon that walks into the room with pediatricians, you can flex and you can still be an effective communicator. When you're a masculine communicator that's been brought up in medicine where we give the facts, and you walk into a family that is emotional, you can flex and let them emote, deal with their emotion, and be an effective communicator. So you want to be able to not only know yourself, but observe the communication styles of those around you. Whether it's a colleague that you just butt up against and don't get along with, why is that? Why can't we work well together? Is it because you're trying to do some verbal sparring and they're more of a feminine communicator? You know, are there things you can pick up on there? Respect that there are differences and that people are going to be that way. You can't fix someone's communication style. You both have to work to flex, to work closer together. And then you want to be able to adapt. You want to be able to take your style and work with it when it's working, but you want to be able to pull from that other style, recognize why there may be some conflicts or why you may not be able to get anywhere with that family, so that you can kind of flex, or you can bring someone else in that may have a different communication style and let them take a stab at it.
I think a great example of this, why is palliative care effective? And so the model of palliative care, when we come into conflict, we're trained to have a very feminine communication style in a very masculine world. Medicine is still fairly conservative and fairly masculine in the way we communicate. Palliative care comes in, and a lot of what we do is attend to emotion. We dive head first into emotion, and we just wallow in it, and we let people emote, because we know that people have to do the emotional work before they can get on to the cognitive stuff. So I was a fellow. I was so proud of myself that I could go in and I could get people to that point. I could very quickly build rapport and get to the emotional stuff that people were blocking and deal with it, and then get to the goals of care, get to the next step. And I remember this consult, it had been a long, long day, and it was in the ICU, it was in the medical ICU, and I was going to meet with this son, a family meeting with this son. His mom had been in ICU for months. She'd coded 5 times. And it was terrible. And he came in, and he knew he was going to meet with these new doctors. Why did they call these new doctors? And so we had this family meeting, and I had my mentor with me, and we went in, and I just did this perfect job of, just attending to emotion. I was telling him how he was such a great son, and he just cared for his mom so much, and this must be so hard watching your mom be so sick. And I just kept going and kept going. And finally, I was getting nothing, nothing back. And I was like, well, clearly he's just got a very thick skin. I just need to keep working and I'll get there. And finally he stopped to me and he goes, listen, I don't mean to disrespect you. He's like, I appreciate what you're doing, but can you just give it to me straight? Is my mom dying? And I remember just screeching to a halt and realizing that this style that I was using was not at all. He wanted a masculine, what do we need to do to fix this? Mom is broken, what do we do? Fix it. And literally, I remember sort of turning to my mentor, and he was he gave me guys, you can do it. And literally, the entire tone of the conversation changed, and it was, you're right, let me just be honest, your mom is dying, she is dying. Let's stop doing the things that are not helping her anymore. Let's do things that are going to help her be comfortable. And literally, it was over in a minute. So that's my that's my vulnerable story about learning the hard way to respect those differences and try to adapt. Anybody have questions or comments or funny stories that they want to share with the group?
I think I've really noticed is because PF is a female dominated, most of our residents are female. get stuff done, because I think like Mary Molly was saying, a lot of times you give an order and it's like a suggestion, because you're not.
Exactly.
And I think it depends on where you work. Like in the nursery where I work with the same nurse all the time, we have a great relationship. There's no totally kind of disconnect. And it depends where you are, but I think it is kind of being conscious of that, especially in where it is the female predominance. But it is different than a lot of other places in others. And kind of trying to help teach people to kind of consider, I guess, more of a masculine form of communication when things need to get done, because for whatever reason, the word masculine has been set up.
It wasn't how long I had it after hours, wasn't how long I had it.
But I think it's people you work with,
But it
maybe
was
they don't know you, it's
but
very
it was
different.
and it may have been a floor issue. I mean, I think that's a very,
I think that girl relationship, female.
we didn't have it on another floor,
Right.
you know? And so I think that it certainly was very possibly an issue, but it was very obvious, you know, that it was you know, there were differences.
Right. And there's not going to be a right or wrong. You're never going to know, I need to use a masculine communication style now and a feminine later. But you may realize in retrospect, why did that nurse get so livid with me, and why are they scowling at me and paging me Q 30 minutes the rest of the night? Oh, it's because I said, get that blood culture an hour ago, and I walked off, instead of, I know that you thought about this, but if you could go ahead and get this, I'm really worried about this patient. You know, you may have to do that with some nurse, and then another nurse you can say, this patient looks septic, get a blood culture, and they're going to get on it. But, you know, you can just kind of take from, oh, that didn't go that well. Why did it not go well? And kind of adapt your style the next time you're dealing with that nurse or that practice. But learning from the lab, I need a masculine communication style if I'm going to get something done. Like, I've got to sound urgent or they're not going to act urgently. And so realizing, okay, I'm a feminine communicator. I've got to flex when I'm talking with a lab. Or I've got to flex when I'm talking with that nurse because I know she's going to want me to communicate in this way.
The other thing that I found too is kind of involving the nurse, if I'm in that communication, involving them in the decision. You know, kind of talking about them, gosh, I'm really worried about this patient because they're really tachycardic and I don't know why. That's why I'm doing this. And that's, you know, kind of taking those few minutes, and then I get, sometimes, not always, but sometimes I'll get less scowls and this kid's fine, why are you doing this workup on this kid? That kind of stuff. But kind of bringing them into the decision making helps, at least perceived, you know, into the discussion at least.
And I think what we all see is the longer we're here, the more relationships we build, and people trust you. And this is, as you build those relationships, then when the time comes that you need to be assertive, and they know that you're being serious. And so it's sort of the best of both worlds. You build relationships, you found this common experience, they trust you, and now you can have a masculine style, and it's not going to butt heads because they trust you. They know that, okay, now's the time to be serious. So.
Coping and grieving for the physician, the role of palliative care is there.
For like us collective?
For the physician, not for the patient so much, but for the physician, the stress, the grief, did I make a mistake, et cetera.
Yeah.
Hey,
the amount of time that we spend attending to the emotion of the medical team is pretty significant, especially in pediatrics. I'd say almost half of the time that I spend in a day is spent dealing with the angst, the collective angst, and the emotion that's happening with all of us.
Nurses, physicians,
yep.
Respiratory therapists.
Because we get so attached to these kids, and we know them, we know their families. We spend a lot of time doing that. And we're doing the exact same thing we're doing with the families. We're listening and attending to emotion, and letting people tell their story and tell about their connection to this kid and how hard it is. I think that's hugely important, and something we're lacking as a health system and as sort of pediatrics in general. That's a great question. I'll put in a shameless plug. We're actually having in September a bereavement lectureship. The AAP awarded children's here this lectureship, where a speaker will come in and we'll actually do it together with the fall AEP, hopefully, the fall meeting. And really the topic is going to be when we take care of kids in disasters and at the end of life and the stress that that brings, the first step is learning how to take good care of each other, because if we all burn out, we cannot take good care of our kids and families. So learning how to, and it's not all going to be sitting down and having support groups and talking it out. How do we learn to do this in a masculine way? How do we do it in a feminine way? How do we find what works for everyone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Other questions or war stories or thoughts? We would really appreciate, yeah.
So I have probably more of a masculine style, and I have this kid with chronic diseases that's going to change his real life forever, essentially. And I probably could use more of a nurse cell. I don't know, use the idea to say, so how are you doing in college? You just went out to get that lupus, that's part of chemotherapy. I mean, it's the idea, they seem like look up your college and ask them to step back and ask them to do these questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we, when we teach fellows, when we teach medical students sort of how to attend to emotion, one of the simplest way we tell people to attend to emotion is to name it. And it seems sort of very silly, like, well, of course they're sad. I just told them their life is going to be changed. But by saying, I know this isn't the news you wanted to hear, this must be really disappointing. What you've said, what you've let the family know is that the conversation is going to stop for a second, that it's important for us to deal with this and acknowledge how much it sucks before we start talking about the next steps. And it gives them enough space to know that they can emote. And I promise you the response will be, you're right, like this floored me. And you'll just get this moment of personal connection. It will build trust, and you'll be able to say, you know, I wish we weren't here dealing with this, but would it be okay if we talk about what this means and what comes next? Does that make sense? Or does that sort of answer that question? It sort of may seem silly to name it or to call it out at that moment, but pausing and saying it out loud will work greatly.
Even before we go into the details of this treatment plan,
Yes.
Talking, so you have lupus, you have arthritis.
Yes, very much so before moving to the treatment plan. Dealing with the emotion, because what do we see all the time? You tell someone they have cancer, and then you say, now we're going to start chemotherapy, and we're going to do this and this. They remember none of it because they were still in shock from the cancer diagnosis from that. So until they deal with the emotional work, they can't get onto the cognitive work. And a lot of times when palliative care is called, because people don't get it, because we run into all this conflict, it's because there's a lot of emotional work that hasn't been done yet. And all we go in and do, we work magic, all we do is we come in and let people cry and just let them talk. And we're like, this really is horrible. Would it be okay if we then talk about what this means? So it's just a much drawn out version of what you would do in clinic. Yeah.
How do you guys go through the bereavement and the coping process? I mean, so you know, if you think about it, you're kind of like the last. You're here, not the last ditch, but I mean,
You're taking care of them.
your job is worse than being a psychiatrist, or I should say,
Sorry, talk to psychiatrist.
But I mean, in the sense of it seems so much that it's conflict resolution or the emoting.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you not become? What are your tips or tools for not internalizing and becoming burnout yourself?
I think it's tricky. Obviously, by the nature of what we do, we're dealing with a lot of very sick patients and patients that are dying. But on the other hand, we haven't been taking care of them for 10 years or 5 years. And so there's a little bit of an ability to protect in just not having that long-term relationship. I think that sometimes we get to develop that, but y'all are in a different place too, because you followed that kid that's had refractory epilepsy for 8 years. And so your grief for that child is going to be different than my grief for that child. I think what's most important is figuring out, how do you grieve effectively? Because we could say we all need to sit down and talk about what happened with this kid and have an M&M and really talk about it. But some people aren't. That's not going to help them. They're just going to kind of shut down more. They need to, take the weekend and go fishing. Or I'm a debriefer, so I come home and I want to talk about it and just kind of talk about what upset me about that and what didn't. And I think most of us on our team probably are. We actually meet as a team once a month with Lou Lacey, the wellness coordinator. I always forget her title, but we meet with her once a month, and it's a standing meeting every fourth Wednesday or something like that, where we meet and we talk about, what have been the hard cases, or what has been hard, because when we get stressed, it comes across in our emotional reactions to each other. And so kind of dealing with that as it comes up. And so we're very proactive in dealing with that because we know we see so much difficult stuff. And I think there's plenty of us in this room that see lots of difficult stuff all the time. And so just figuring out what is effective for me and being proactive about it. So trying to kind of do it on a regular basis. Does that help or answer a little bit?
Thank you.